Hello, this is Jim Pellegrino, your host for The Hour, and today we've got a guest by the name of Brendan Sharkey. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
For the audience's benefit, Brendan is the Speaker of the Connecticut General Assembly House, 7-term representative out of Hamden, and also I'm delighted to report the co-owner of a small business, which gives you a good perspective.
That's true.
Yes. I should tell the audience that your host today, Brendan, has a combination of a sinus infection, a cold, and laryngitis. This is my godfather voice, Brendan.
I feel your pain.
If in the middle of the interview I run out of my voice, you can ask yourself some questions.
Perfect. That sounds good. We'll do sign language.
Okay. So the first thing I wanted to go, we've got close to a half hour, Brendan, which is good because there's a lot of major topics to talk about.
Yeah.
The first one I wanted to talk to you about, I know you're right in the middle of this whole quote-unquote gun legislation that's going on. Could you give us kind of a synopsis of where we are with this right now?
Sure. It's, I think, important in context to understand a little bit. After the tragedy in December, we got in Newtown,
right.
We got together as leaders and agreed to form a process that has never been done before in Connecticut. That's outside the normal legislative process, where we'd have a committee made up of equally of Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, to work on an immediate response to the issues that we face as a result of the Newtown tragedy, in dealing in 3 subject areas: gun safety, mental health, and school safety. And those committees have been meeting since January to come up with recommendations that we could place into what we call an emergency certified bill that would be acted on immediately without the normal legislative process, and do so in on a consensus bipartisan basis. So that's where we are now. The committees have finished up their work, and they've made their recommendations, and now it's really up to the leaders in both House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, to package the bill, to put together the things in the bill. The biggest and most that's drawing the most attention, I think, is obviously the gun safety issues, where we have, I think, a tremendous amount of common ground, and we're now in the process of working out the details on some of the things that we're not necessarily in agreement about between Democrats and Republicans, but we're in the midst of those negotiations now. They're going very well, and I think we're going to have something very soon.
Brendan, just a quick follow-up question.
Sure.
Connecticut has one of the toughest gun laws, I think, in the country. Top 2 or 3, whatever. So, I mean, where other states may be passing legislation like this, they've got this kind of opportunity, right, to close in on the gun legislation, right? But with Connecticut, we're so tight already, my words, not yours, that how much more opportunity is left when we have such tough laws already?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think we already have, for example, an assault weapons ban, quote unquote, that we adopted back in 1993. And there is room, though, for expanding that ban to include the kinds of weapons that Adam Lanza used in Newtown. There are things that have been adopted and adapted since the '93 ban, which just preceded the federal ban that has now since expired. Ours still is in effect. Where gun manufacturers have made changes, subtle and otherwise, to enable certain long guns, as we call them, the rifle assault weapon type looking guns, from now they're, to make them legal for purchase here in Connecticut. And I think there are certain things that we should be tightening up to eliminate those. I personally, and I'll just say, I personally am very pro-gun safety. That's been my legislative history and my voting history all along, and I would agree with everything that the governor's proposed and others have. But I also agree that I also believe that we need to maintain the integrity of that bipartisan process and come up with recommendations together.
Well, I would imagine last question would be, Brendan, I would imagine that your balancing act is kind of tough because the stakeholders that are involved, right, is the legislature, is the general population, are the gun manufacturers and people who feel very strongly about the Second Amendment.
Right.
I mean, bringing this whole cast of characters, and I say that affectionately, together to come out with some common agreement. It's got to be no mean task.
Yeah, and each of the leaders,
a lot of emotion involved.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And each of the leaders, I think, comes at it from a different perspective, where they're trying to reflect what they believe the public wants, but also we all as leaders have to protect the folks who are in our own caucuses.
Sure.
So a leader doesn't generally want to go way out ahead of where the members of their caucus may be on certain issues. So it's a difficult balancing act that we're trying to walk. It's not as easy sometimes to do the bipartisan thing.
Yeah, I guess where I come from, just my general editorial comment, Brenda, would be this, that I believe that any process can be optimized to some degree. It's only a matter of degree. So my applaud for trying to do that. The only thing that I get upset with from time to time is people who feign a solution. And what I mean by that is, if we do this, then this will never happen again. And I think that turns people off, as opposed to editorializing about how we can optimize, like the background checks, as opposed to saying, if we did this, Newtown never would have happened. I think people get turned off by that.
Yeah, I think everyone is reaching for the solution that will prevent a Newtown from ever happening, but it's not easy to come up with.
Next subject. Over the next couple of fiscal years, there is scheduled to be, at least in the governor's budget, about $550 million of cuts among all the hospitals in the state. Now, on one side, you've got the governor essentially saying, you know what, I mean, you got a lot more patients nowadays, there's some other mitigating factors, you need to get used to the austerity and take care of the $550 million. They're saying we may have to close hospitals, we may have to lay off people, et cetera. 550 is a big number, Brendan. That's a big number. What's your view on that?
Well, particularly, it's a particularly big number when you also consider that we took a lot from the hospitals in the deficit mitigation plan we did in December, in mid-year. And this was in the middle of their fiscal years, so they had to make adjustments on the fly in terms of their profitability and bottom line. I think there's also I think where the governor's coming from is the sense that with Obamacare taking effect January of 2014, that more people will have health insurance who will be coming to the hospitals for care. And that will reduce the number of folks coming to hospitals who have no coverage whatsoever that the hospitals have to accept on a charity basis. So in that sense, the governor's position is that that charity, what we call the dish payments, we make a contribution to hospitals for those people who come in who have no coverage whatsoever. That population is going to drop dramatically thanks to the Obamacare, where coverage will occur. Medicaid, but the problem, the other side of that is that most of those people will also be on Medicaid.
Right, exactly.
And Medicaid only pays a fraction of a dollar of the actual cost of providing the service. You also hear those who say that hospitals charge, $3 a pill for aspirin, and that some of their own internal cost matrices are not in keeping with reality. So it's a very complicated subject. I am sympathetic to the notion that hospitals can't be expected to just keep absorbing these cuts cold turkey. And without
Brendan, you and I both know from business that anybody, when they're approached to take the first 5 to 10% out, you say, okay. And then you go 10, 15% or 20%. And you're going from flesh to bones by the time you're going 15, 20, 25%. And it just seems to me that $550 million is a big number. And quite frankly, in the interest of disclosure, I know a lot of people in the hospital industry, and most of whom I know are very responsible men and women, and they don't cry very often. But I think you're right. One of the things I have heard was that deficit mitigation, and now this is on top of it. Having said that, so your position on gun control is fairly clear. You've said from the beginning that you've always been a strong advocate of tightening things up. Your position on the hospitals is what?
That we need to be careful in how much we ask the hospitals to absorb.
Okay. Next, one of your favorite subjects, I'm sure. This is, I'll have to introduce my question by making an editorial comment.
Yeah.
As a taxpayer, Brendan, right? What was recently passed was the highest tax rate in history. We're still running a deficit. We've got $1 billion deficit facing us in the next 2 years consecutively, right? And from what I can tell from the governor's budget, our spending is still increasing 9%. Now, when I do business math 101, these things don't add up in my mind. I mean, they add up, but they don't add up.
Right.
What's your view of this situation, Brendan?
Well, I think, I was just talking to folks at CBIA this past week, and I cautioned them about throwing the 9% number around, that over 2 years we're increasing spending by 9%. Once again, you have to factor in that number reflects the beginning of Obamacare, where the state will be receiving a 100% reimbursement from the federal government for our Medicaid costs. Now, we book that on the expense side here in Connecticut as an expense, but 100% of it is now going to be reimbursed. So yes, spending technically is increasing by 9%, but that's because our Medicaid population is growing, and we're getting 100% reimbursement on that, so that the net effect is well below 9%.
Yeah, our state is getting older, Brendan. 1/3 of our population is going to be over 65, not all that soon, right?
That's right.
So it plays into all the dynamics that are going on. Brendan, I hear what you say about the government's going to reimburse us 100%. I respect that. Here's what I don't respect. Nancy Pelosi telling us that we got to pass the bill in order to find out what's in it. And they're like, from a friend of mine told me in Washington, you'll appreciate this as a lawyer, that out of the 2,600 pages, they're up to like, I don't know, page 1,800 and 1,900, and already 50,000 rules and regulations have come out of the thing. Brendan, I'll tell you what, you got a hell of a thing coming at you like a freight train.
Well, philosophically,
Okay.
if you believe that people in America need to have a consistent and available and affordable health care program, and that's a right that people deserve, there were a lot of ways to go about doing that when it was first created. One way would be to just expand Medicare to the entire population, the way we do for those 65 and older. Just make it available to everybody. Actually, Medicare is, from independent evaluators, Medicare actually runs very efficiently as a program. But the idea of government-run health care was always a bugaboo, right? So what we did was, what they did in Washington was create a program that's based on the private sector, with insurance companies still in the game, offering health care coverage now to everyone. That's supposed to help our insurance companies so that they wouldn't be going out of business on the health care side. They're going to get a lot more people now who are going to be buying their health care coverage. And in any way you do it, it was going to be complicated. It was going to be complicated. And I'm not trying to justify Nancy Pelosi's comments. And
no, I know you're not.
But I think it's inevitable that if you're going to actually institute a health care program that's available for as many people as possible, it's going to be complicated.
Well, Brendan, we'll have you back next year and the year after when you're in your second term as Speaker.
Yeah.
We'll continue talking about
fair.
this.
That's
okay?
fair.
All right, so what we're looking at is $1 billion next year and the year after.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying about the 9%.
Yeah.
But, Brendan, from this flows our reputation, right? We used to call Massachusetts Taxachusetts, right? There has to be, and I don't know what the number is, but you use the word philosophically, there has to be a limit to the amount of taxation, spending, and borrowing that we do. Yeah. I think it's a common perception out there, Brendan, you know this, that we're a little bit out of control when it comes to this spending issue. And some really hard decisions have to be made. And do you feel as though your House, Williams Senate, the governor, has the political will to make those kind of tough decisions?
Yeah, I think so. I think the governor laid down a marker that no new taxes in this budget. I support that, and I think there are a lot of folks on our caucus who would be willing to see increases at the top end of the income scale, increases on those folks. Look, I think that what our fundamental problem in Connecticut is that we don't have a tax system that matches the government that we need to have. Now, we can define what we need to have in government, but we don't have a tax system that actually corresponds with what we need, which means, A, we don't have a tax system that accurately promotes the kind of growth or economy that we need to have in the state. We don't have the kind of tax system that adequately funds the programs and services that we need to have in the state of Connecticut. And we also don't have a tax system that is fair. We have a tax system that relies disproportionately on the property tax. More than any other tax, more than income, more than sales. We rely on the property tax as the main vehicle to run government when you consider local and state government. And it's out of whack. And we need to do a really more comprehensive overhaul. That's why I'm pushing at my own level to focus on the property tax in particular, which is why this Moore Commission.
Well, Brendan, look, I don't envy your job. I mean, it's like herding cats up there. And I mean, look at an article came out, Brendan. Look at this: no tax increases. Lawmakers don't agree with Malloy. And buried in this article, it says some Democratic lawmakers are proposing increases in income, estate, corporate sales, and cigarette taxes. And then there's a group out there called Better Choices for Connecticut that is urging Malloy to seek an extra $835 million from taxpayers. And the last thing is there's a legislator here who has proposed what is called combined reporting for Connecticut businesses, that if you got a presence here, that it should be taxed based on where your whole corporation. Now, I'm not here to say that any of these ideas are bad, but you know what, Brendan, you and I both know as business people, but you do reach a point where you say, stop. Stop. We can't go on like this anymore. So how do you get the word out to the boys and girls in the General Assembly?
Well, I think fundamentally, the biggest problem that we have as a state with regard to our business climate is inconsistency. I think that we've run for the last 15, 20 years, the last generation, a government that really was somewhat rudderless when it came to understanding what we needed to do to grow jobs, grow businesses, provide the kind of workforce that businesses want, and stay consistent throughout. So we had an actual plan that people could understand and that we stuck to, right? I think Governor Malloy actually deserves a lot of credit because he's the first governor that we've had in a while, and I'm being a little partisan here, I realize, but he's the first governor that we've had who understood that. And it's something we've been talking about as Democrats in the legislature about the need for consistency in our policies on what do we want to focus on, where do we want to put our money, what industries do we want to promote in the state, and what overall is the plan for growing small business in the state. This governor gets that. There's no question about that. And that's the change that we have to have. The problem with a lot of the things that come up is what I talked about earlier, consistency and a tax system that works and that actually represents what we want to achieve versus what we need to do to get through the next little crisis. So
yeah, let me see if I can draw kind of a crude analogy, Brendan, right? In business, on the revenue side, we can raise prices just so much, right? And if you raise it beyond a certain level, you lose your market. Your customer says, I'm not paying anymore. Government is different than that. On the revenue side, here's the situation. The situation is taxation is considered revenue, right? And if I don't pay my taxes, you know what happens to me? I go to jail. But in business, when our customers don't want to pay their price, they just go somewhere else. That to me is your challenge, Brendan.
That's right.
And I appeal to you, as a businessman and a private citizen, you got to get them to hold the lid down, which is a perfect segue to, I noticed that people have proposed a minimum wage increase. Over the next 2 years, as I read this proposal, it's 20% over the next 2 years, and then in the third year, it's tied to inflation, which means it's never ending, okay? As a small business owner, I noticed, I was reading on how Brendan positioned himself for this, and you were essentially saying, easy, we have to understand the ramifications to small business. Where are you going with this, Brendan?
Yeah, I agree.
They're pushing.
That is where I stand. I think that I understand the desire and the need for us to provide folks with a living wage, and the ability to earn the money for the hard work that they do that's sufficient for them to maintain their own lives and their families' lives. And I'm not seeing evidence right now to suggest that the minimum wage that we currently have in place is not providing that. Yes, it's, obviously those who are making minimum wage struggle. It's not enough money, but I haven't seen any direct evidence to suggest that by increasing the minimum wage by 25 or 50 cents an hour is going to demonstrably affect those folks' cost of living or their ability to manage their budgets. That's what I need to be able to justify an increase in the minimum wage. I think sometimes it becomes a bit of a it becomes a bit of a marker for people that are you with those who are at the low end of the income scale or not. And I'm not sure that's the way we should be devising the policy. It seems to me if there is a demonstrated if it's been demonstrated that those making a minimum wage are not actually able to make it in our society, then I can justify that.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I think we've got to, obviously the problem for small business is that if this is going to be a huge burden on small businesses, what good is it in the end?
Well, I mean, here's my, I'll use the word crude again, analogy, Brendan, and that is, this is like doing a study on minimum wage is like doing a study on whether or not the tide's going to come in, right? We know the tide comes in twice a year. All these kids that are out here that are doing this show, right? If all of them worked for me and they came in at minimum wage, although they probably wouldn't as college students, but if they came in as minimum wage, right? Yep. And someone told me that I was going to be giving these kids 20% in raises over the next 2 years, I don't need some professor from my alma mater to do a statistical study to tell me I can't afford to give them a 20% pay raise.
Right.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let some of them go,
right.
or I'm not going to hire anymore.
Exactly.
In the gut of Brendan Sharkey's, well, in your gut, Brendan, you know as a businessman that sometimes you don't need a study. I just can't afford it.
Yeah.
And
yeah, and I think we're in too fragile a state right now in
the
Connecticut.
timing is terrible.
Yeah, it gets frustrating sometimes because I know that my friends, a lot of my friends who are proposing these ideas are doing what they think is the right thing to do with regard to protecting those who need help. I understand and respect that, but I think there's got to be some balance in this, and recognizing that small businesses need help right now, that Connecticut is fragile in its economy.
Brendan, my last comment would be this: the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I'm telling you right now that just like I think everybody should serve 2 years in the military, I think everybody should have, and we know it's impossible, a little tour of duty and walk in our shoes, run a small business, and come to the same conclusions you come to.
Right.
If you got to do that, you're going to come to different conclusions some of the time.
Right. Agreed.
Appreciate you letting me editorialize.
Fair enough.
Okay, two other things.
Sure.
The release program gained a great deal of notoriety, letting people out early. Fact is, in my hometown in Meriden, we had a tragic accident by one of the ones who lived. Where are you on that?
Well, I think that a lot of the facts of the program against the tragic circumstances that occurred need to be clarified. I think that if you actually look at our release policies with regard to good behavior and all those things, we have, and this may come as a shock to some of your listeners, but we have actually one of the strictest policies in the United States with regard to early release. Stricter than Texas, stricter than most of the states in the country that you would think would be hardcore on these issues. And the program that was introduced last year was not designed to let folks out early because we love our criminals and we want to coddle them, but it was designed to.
You don't want to run on that campaign.
No, of course not. The program was designed to provide some level of incentive for current inmates to get either the job training or the education or the psychological help that they needed, that put them there in the first place, so that we don't send these people back out onto the streets to do the exact same thing that they did all over again.
Yeah.
And the result of that program is really not, it's a fairly negligible amount of time reduction that's awarded in exchange for them doing these programs. And even with those reductions, even if they took full advantage of them, they're still the strictest in the country.
Brendan, I happen to agree with you, but what you and I both know from a public relations point of view, all it takes is one or two crimes.
Exactly, and that's just it.
And I wanted to end this part of it, Brenda, by asking you, aren't we in a situation now where we have empty jails, for want of it, not totally empty, but we've got a lot of room now, right? Why do we need the program at all? Why can't they serve out their whole sentence?
Well,
we have the space now.
Yeah, it's not really a space issue. It's about a recidivism issue.
Okay.
That's really what the purpose of that was. And you're right, it just got a lot of bad PR because there were a couple of people who, one of whom actually didn't qualify for it. I know that the media said he qualified and that's how he got out, but actually that wasn't even true. So it draws a lot of heat and attention, and I think for political reasons, folks stoked it a bit. But the reality is, when you look at the facts of this,
it's tough because the recidivism rate has always been 50, 60, 70%. That's tough. We've only got about 2 minutes left, Brendan. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to editorialize a bit about this commission that you have formed to help cities and towns reduce costs.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, this is called the MORE Commission, which stands for Municipal Opportunities and Regional Efficiencies. It was something that I chaired 4 years ago when Chris Donovan first became Speaker. And the purpose of this was to create a dialogue between the state, town leaders, and other interested parties to look at the ways in which we can create more efficiencies at the local level. I've been a longtime advocate for regionalism and trying to find those places where it makes more sense to provide services on a multi-town or regional basis. But it goes beyond that too, in terms of how we even deliver services efficiently at the local level. I can go into details of examples, but so I wanted to reinstitute the MORE Commission, this time on a bipartisan basis. Before it was not, it was a partisan thing. I wanted to make it a bipartisan thing. And really, I think it's also becoming very important this year as Governor Malloy's proposed budget recommends a lot of changes to revenue streams for cities and towns. I think this will give the towns a voice as to how we can perhaps make some of those ideas a little bit better.
We got about a minute left. I wish you luck with that.
Thank you.
Speaking of controversial things between the governor and cities and towns, there's a now famous, we have 1 minute left. The car tax. Give us a 30-second editorial on the car tax.
I agree with the governor that we need to eliminate the car tax. It's onerous, hard to enforce. It's the most hated tax in the state. The way he's doing it, I would not agree with. I think we need to, we can phase it out in a much more gradual way. That won't have this huge impact on local property taxes.
And it does. I think the number I read was like $600–700 million or something like that. Which in turn,
because towns
if they can't cut spending, they're going to put it in the property tax anyway.
That's right.
Brendan, we're out of time, and I must tell you that I'm delighted to hear that we have a Speaker of the House that sees both sides of the issue. I do not envy you your task over the next 2 years, but I wish you the best of success.
Thank you very much.
I really do. You're a good man.
Appreciate it.
Good having you on the show.
Okay, thank you.
And Brendan, I'm saving all my notes.
All right.
So when we have you back, I'll
Yeah.
just take them all out again.